Well, welcome everyone. This is Hacking HR from the Middle East, Dubai, United Arab Emirates. My name is Brad Boyson. I want to welcome everyone from around the world watching this, and I want to thank Enrique for the opportunity to profile our particular part of the world, which is referred to as the Middle East. A bit of full disclosure first, all of our panelists today are actually based in Dubai. So I want to be clear to the region and to everyone watching, although our topic is the Middle East, we are all based in Dubai. So that will have a bit of a bias, but full disclosure, everyone on this panel has also had responsibilities in the greater GCC and Middle East area too. So we are speaking from the hub of the United Arab Emirates. I want to give our panelists the opportunity to introduce themselves right now. Maybe I can start with Gio, if you don't mind.
No, of course. Thank you, Brett. So, hey, everybody. My name is Giovanni, Everduin. I work as a senior advisor with a couple of companies, and I usually advise them around topics like transformation, culture, strategy. And outside of that, I am also running the Hacking HR Dubai chapter. And I'm really excited about being here this morning, depending on when you look at this morning in Dubai.
Exactly. Thank you, Gio. Perhaps we can go to Craig next.
Good morning, everybody. Craig Osteen, Head of Talent and Learning for RAKBANK, based here in the Middle East. Been out in the GCC now for the last 7 years, specialising in the talent management and L&D spaces, predominantly in the financial services sector. Prior to that, 26 years working for Lloyds Banking Group in London. So a big transition coming out into the region, which we'll talk about a little bit more shortly. Looking forward to it.
Thank you, Craig. And David, please.
Yes, good morning, everyone. So I've been in this region for over 10 years, covering Middle East and Africa, most of the roles, over 25 years of HR experience. And in the last 15 years, really worked for a lot of companies which you can call in the fourth industrial revolution. So companies like IBM, Cognos, IDEMIA, and Genzyme. I'm currently work as a vice president sales Middle East and Africa for a company called KPISOFT, what is basically performance management solution based on augmented analytics.
Thank you, David. So that's our panel. Myself, again, Brad Boyson. If you haven't, those of you watching haven't noticed, we are all expats living in a foreign country here in the United Arab Emirates. And that's one of the unique aspects of work in this particular region, is that such a large percentage of the workforce are foreign nationals. So while the topic is the workplace experience in the Middle East, I'm sure a lot of the topics that we'll be going through today and questions will be familiar to HR and people professionals all around the world. But I think the starting point for our panel, given the uniqueness of our work environment, is perhaps answering a question that I think everyone on this panel has asked themselves before, and a lot of people think about when they think of this region, if they're not citizens or nationals of the region, is how is it that you come to work in this foreign region, and what were your expectations of moving to another location and working in perhaps a different region, a different culture? So maybe I'll start with Gio, and the sort of common question that we'll start off with was, what was your misconceptions? You know, you've been in the region for a while now, and everyone on this panel has. Before you came here, what was your perception about the work experience in the Middle East, the GCC, the UAE, and Dubai in particular? And what were some of the things that were valid? What were some of the things that perhaps proved not to be true? If you can share.
Well, that's the question, Brad.
I know.
So you know what? I'm gonna flip it a little bit because I came, when I first came to the Middle East, I actually went to Kuwait. I was working with Accenture out of the London office at the time, and I was doing a project with the national oil company in Kuwait. And so I moved, basically, that was my first foray into the Middle East. And from there, I kind of moved to Dubai. I got a job in Dubai. So my experience was actually quite different than what people probably would expect, because I was already expecting Kuwait, right? So I'd lived there for about a year and I was expecting Kuwait. And then when I came to Dubai, it's actually fundamentally different. I think it's kind of like one of those New York, US, or London, UK, Amsterdam, Netherlands. I'm Dutch, so I can relate to that. Is that Dubai is a very, very different city within a very, very different region. And even though there's things that are very common across the region, I think Dubai is almost a standalone in terms of infrastructure, in terms of level of progressiveness, if you ask me. So some of the things that I expected, I didn't expect the crazy level of dynamic and infrastructure. I wasn't quite ready for that. And if for those of you who've been to, for instance, Kuwait, even though it's a great place, if you can contrast it with Dubai, Dubai is a very different place, right? And the second thing I would say is typically my friends, when they come here, they kind of have this misperception that, you know, it's this kind of place where a lot of things are not allowed and there's like a lot of rules. But actually, for everyone who lives here, they'll be able to tell you that it's actually pretty Western, right? And not to say that that's good or bad, but it's pretty Western. I think that's something that really stands out in terms of all of the things that, you know, you may not expect to find here that you would find wherever home is, you can actually find here.
Great. Yeah, it's. I know for myself, coming to this region, especially when you work in HR and you become aware of government policies as it relates to types of work like human resources and the push to have citizens and nationals work in certain roles. For me, one of the questions I had to resolve was, why would I, as an HR professional, come into a region where one of the roles that I'm targeting, HR, is highly targeted for nationalization? And for those of you who aren't familiar with the region, it's the government policies to ensure citizens are fully engaged and employed in the workforce, and there are certain jobs that are given more, if you will, preference to nationals. And I think for me, one of the things I had to resolve in getting here, like you talked about infrastructure, Gio, is that there's such a demand for talent, genuine talent that's going to contribute to your organization, that's going to contribute to the region and the economy, that if you're a person that is by global standards talented, this is the type of region that can really take advantage of your skills and competency. So with that, Craig, perhaps your misconceptions and learning outcomes from sort of having worked here for a few years?
Yeah, no problem. I think aligned to Gio, really, there's some very clear synergies with that. But my story is a little bit different. Having worked in London for 26 years, I had an opportunity. I had a really good mentoring discussion with one of the guys back at home. And one of the things that was missing for me was international experience. And it was just really weird how this worked out. Middle East was always an area that had fascinated me, both culturally and just some of the innovative things that I was hearing about it. So I actually took a leap of faith. So I sat at the plane at Heathrow Airport and I jumped onto that plane and I went and I did it. And I have to say, this last 7 years have been the most rewarding of my career, having taken that leap of faith and arrived. My misconceptions before I came were, you know, will I need to speak Arabic? Is that going to be a blocker for me? You know, culturally, how will I fit? Now, I have a typical London sense of humour and how I work. How will that fit with the cultures working out here? It took a little while to understand how I connect that all together. But the good news is that the humour works, and you know, not only that, the experience has just been absolutely fantastic. I think it's not to underestimate the cultural piece, because I think for people that are thinking about coming to the region to work, it's about respecting the cultures, but I have to say it's about learning from the cultures as well. So one of the things that's I'm really hungry to do is constantly learn and learn about myself. And I think coming to the region has certainly allowed me to do that. So just a couple of those misconceptions which were put to bed very early on. I think as a region also, using your words, if you are talented and you are somebody that can really help the country make a difference, then you're welcomed absolutely with open arms. I have a great boss, very empowered to do what I do, and I'm doing things here that I probably wouldn't have been doing in London. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on.
Yeah, I think that's one thing, you know, the ambitions of the leaders of these countries, not just in the government, but in the private sector, semi-government, you know, the goals to become not just world-class, but to be leading and innovative in certain sectors is one of the things that attract a lot of people to the region. and the hub that is Dubai. David, your misconceptions before you got here?
Well, I also had this idea about learning Arabic, but that was quickly kind of like moved away. So I came here after the acquisition of a company called Cognos by IBM, and after I completed the integration for Europe, I moved to a kind of like a headquarter role in Dubai, covering Middle East and Africa. And to my big disappointment, I was surrounded by Germans, British, Americans. Not that I have anything against it, but I felt like I was back in Europe. And I think there's a big difference between companies, global companies that are based in free zones versus, for example, multinational companies who are based outside of the free zones here. So my experience was almost like similar as I was back in Europe, until I volunteered to take on the Middle East role. And then I really felt like, okay, now I'm learning about the UAE labor law. Now I'm learning about Saudi Arabia. Now I'm learning about Qatar and many other places. So that was a kind of like my misconception, working for a global company, coming in the region, being in a regional role.
Yeah, it's such, and I think that's common around the world, where you have that expat workforce that works for large multinationals and is moving around, and the classic sort of large industries, oil and gas, maybe transportation, hospitality. But once again, to those of you who aren't familiar with this region, the percentage of that workforce here is truly unique. And when we talk about the workplace experience in the Middle East, every country has its ratios, but you look at the Emirate of Dubai, the state of Dubai, and it's upwards of 90% of the workforce are foreign nationals. And the country itself, the UAE, is around 80%. And then if you look in the region, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and the Levant regions, it starts to sort of, as the hub, you have less and less foreign nationals working. And David, your point is so valid, is you come to a foreign country, yet if you stay in your bubble, if you don't actually get connected with the local community, in some respect, you might as well be back home if you're sticking together with your cohorts, your nationals. So, and I personally see, different people making different efforts to that, and whether it's learning Arabic or working for a UAE or GCC owned or operated organization. Back to your point about the free zone, again, some people who may not be familiar with this region, is this free zone is a geographic legal distinction of economics that's like offshore. So I think everyone that would be watching this would be familiar with sort of offshore economies, legal jurisdictions, and what they've done in this region, Dubai in particular, but throughout the region, is created zones that allow for different percentages of foreign ownership, and different organizations will choose where they might set up based on their customers, based on the legal jurisdiction. And so I think everyone here has had some experience either living in, or not living, but working in a free zone. And that is one of the different elements of the workplace experience. So transitioning to sort of a more direct question before we do some deep dives, just to follow up on the first question. What is the one thing that is fundamentally different? I mean, there's many different things, but you can travel all over the world and people say, well, it's different here. Like Gio was saying, it's different in New York from LA, it's different in London than it is from, Northern Ireland. So that's not really an insightful observation. So with our panelists today, I want to ask you, what is the one thing that you feel is most different about the work experience in your experience? Maybe let's go in the reverse order. David, do you mind starting?
Yeah, I think the one thing that is really noticeable about Dubai, but I think also around in more countries that's the same case, or more territories it's the same case, is the multicultural level of our workforce. Like, you can be in a meeting room and like with 10 people, and each of them is from a different nationality. I mean, I'm from Holland, Amsterdam, The Hague, they also have multicultural workforces, but people are still kind of like from the same country. Here, it's literally right. People came directly from their own country. So that makes it pretty unique, I would say.
Yeah, and just adding to what you said is a lot of parts of the world have different ratios of immigration, and certain countries are really focused on that. But part of what's unique in the chemistry here is almost all people who are from different countries they're not second or third or fourth generation. It's all first generation. They're from these other cultures and countries, and that is unique to the region. Craig, your thoughts?
Yeah, I have to agree with David, and I think one of the biggest learns for me was the whole cultural awareness piece. I think that brings its own opportunities and it brings its own challenges. And I think from a personal experience of having worked in the region now for 7 years, as David said, you could be one moment working with a full team of Emiratis. So I had the great honour, I'll give you an example of that, great honour of working with Sheikh Mohammed's team on a specific nationalisation initiative, which was fantastic. So my style of how I engaged with the team was slightly different. I had to learn the approaches and best approaches. Then, as David said, you would meet Europeans, you would meet people from all over the world. So the one thing, whereas you would just naturally assume you would go into a meeting and tackle the meeting, you have to think about how you deliver some of those messages to make sure that they're received in the appropriate way or the direct way. And I think, having worked in London for 26 years and spent lots of time in and out of employment tribunals and all that wonderful stuff, I thought I was pretty diverse until I came to the region. And I have to be honest, it's been an absolute eye-opener. But as I said, it brings its own challenges and opportunities, and I think it's what you make of those. But it's to be mindful that different cultures will react to things in a different way. So it's about being very much aware of that.
Thank you. And Gio, your thoughts?
Do I have to pick one?
Yes, you do. And you have to prioritize it. That's the wisdom of being a subject matter expert.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I guess if I have to pick one thing that is, in my opinion, really unique, I'd probably say, and this is a really interesting one, is that in this country in particular, in the region, particularly in this country, I would say it's the government who's pushing innovation and progression, particularly in the HR space, but generally a lot more than the private sector, right? In fact, you could arguably say that the private sector is somewhat lagging behind the government when it comes to setting the tone in terms of innovation, digital, and kind of ushering in the future of work or the future of whatever the future is. So I think that was a very, very big kind of surprise for me, that you come in here, and in most countries where I've worked in geographies, whether it's US or Europe, even parts of Asia, it's typically the private sector that is kind of pushing innovation through equivalents of Silicon Valley. But here it's really the government who's doing it. I think that's a really, really big difference. It's
a great insight, and I know in my experience in my previous position, having worked with private sector, government sector, again, I come from North America, where you have this sort of stereotype that innovation does come from the private sector. And I agree with you, Gio, that the innovation is driven by the government sector here. But ironically, as much as it's driven by the government sector, I still do feel like the private sector is moving faster. So in that sense, some of the applications of innovation, my experience has been, do happen faster in the private sector. But were it not for the leadership of the government sector and the commitment to innovate and create and be world class, I don't think, whether it's government or private sector, there would be that sort of confidence to, one of my favorite stories in terms of a learning intervention was, I was doing a workshop with a group of Emiratis, almost exclusively Emiratis. And one of the questions came up that I said to them, innovation, you do realize that a lot of you are doing quite administrative work. And as work and as the economy becomes more reliant on technologies and machine learning, a lot of the things that you do now will become challenged and perhaps maybe even obsolete from the worker point of view, and the technology will take over this. Isn't that a bit threatening? And this one lady spoke up very quickly, and she said, you know what, and those of you who've been in the region, you know that often the leadership will, in many parts of the world, government offices, you'll have presidents, prime ministers, pictures, ambassadors, pictures. And this lady pointed to the leaders of the UAE and said, we trust them. It was as simple as that. If you know the history of the region, if you know the history of the UAE, I'm older than this country. you know, in terms of as a legal establishment, and it's such a young dynamic. And when you've developed that confidence to be progressive in, you know, all types of ways, it's such a fascinating and unique dynamic in the workforce. And I'm just, hopefully I'm adding to what all three of you said as well. But transitioning to my next question, and I'm going to come back to Gio for this one. I think one of the challenges of this workforce dynamic in the Middle East and the GCC and the UAE is this idea of the expat. It isn't just about being a foreign national. It's about the transient nature of the workforce. You know, historically, going back 30 years ago, you'd have the oil and gas industries, and people from other parts of the world would come in and do projects, and it would be very narrow. But now with a more diversified economy, you have expats coming in, but there's still this transient aspect to the workforce that you probably don't see in other parts of the world. Let me ask it in sort of a pointed way, but I'll know you'll fill in the gaps. Is that a good or bad thing? How does that work towards the agenda of the country in terms of its development? What are your thoughts, Gio?
I think it's both a good and a bad thing at the same time. It's kind of like Schrodinger's cat. Look, I think the issue that you have here, and again, for people who are not too familiar with the region, there is no path to citizenship, right? For, I would say, 95, 99% of the population, the expat population that is here. And that's very clear, right? When you come here, it's like a social contract. You know that you're coming here. You can stay here for a very long time. You can prosper here, as all of us have done, and that's why we're still here. But for most of us, we're never going to be able to become a citizen of the country. That creates a very interesting dynamic at multiple levels. Like, one of the most critical ones, and I think the government is actively looking to address that right now, is strategic workforce planning. Right? The region wants to position itself. It has a very bold and ambitious agenda for the next 50 or 75 years. And talent is a main driver of that. So how do you ensure that you maintain and kind of attract and retain that talent? Now, strategic workforce planning effectively is a combination of succession planning and replacement planning. What you have here at the senior levels is replacement planning, not succession planning when it comes to expats, right? And now you tie that into nationalization, which is obviously a key agenda. And as much as everyone will tell you that this is great and we want to do this, the truth is, once it hits someone, that you're grooming your successor, but there's no path for you to grow, you know, somewhere else, you're effectively planning your replacement. And for some people, they are perfectly comfortable with that because they came with a certain mindset and a certain expectation. But let's be honest, not everyone is. And what you get then is survivalism, right? So why would you do that? Because the moment you lose your job, you lose your visa, your family loses their visa, you have to uproot the family and move. And that's something what I see quite a bit, where people kind of, I would say, I'm not going to say very strong words, but I'd say where people are a little out of sync with the government agenda of nationalization, because it immediately impacts their own survival and well-being. And what you've seen recently, if you follow the region, is the government, both here, Saudi Arabia, they're experimenting with longer-term visas, 5-year, 10-year visas. They're experimenting with, property ownership being linked to a visa, and all of that is to kind of bind people longer and give them more of a sense of, I would say it is residency, but it's kind of like maybe a mix between residency and citizenship, to ensure that you keep some of that talent. Because now what happens, for instance, is, after all of us hit the retirement age, it's very unlikely for people who retire expats to stay in the region, right? Because if you no longer have a job, unless you have your own company, you typically end up having to leave. But that's a massive pool of talent and skills from a board and governance, which is a very important part in this part of the world, right? So you're kind of losing out on that. So how do you keep those? I don't know if I actually answered your question or just added more questions to it. But I think there's some really unique challenges here. And I think the next 5 years will be pretty critical to solve some of those.
Well, and I don't think there's an easy answer, that's for sure, for these types of questions. But I think back to 2008, 2009, where there was the global financial crisis. And like many parts of the world, people's jobs were upended. But in this particular region, I think one of the lessons that I hope was learned in the government and the private sector is, this need to retain talent. And I think one of the challenges that happened at that time was a lot of really talented people were forced to leave the region through no fault of their own. And it was, a bit of a brain drain when the region is very actively trying to, become a hub of knowledge economics. And so your point is well taken. I'll open it up. David, Craig, anyone want to step in on this?
Well, Gio already covered quite a bit.
Yeah.
I would like to add to that is also when you look at retirement planning, some of us might be very good in saving. Some of us might be able to survive from what we call the end of service benefit, what is very common in this region. But kind of like a good retirement planning would also help to kind of like build a longer term future next to extended visas. Because just to give the context here, if you are in the mainland of the UAE, normally a visa is only valid for 2 years. So each 2 years, theoretically, you have a chance that you might not get it. It will hardly happen, but people still have to live in this kind of like fear around these visas. So I feel like there is a drive now for longer term visas, like Gio said, and I think it's a good one. The other thing is a bit more trickier, but at the same time, it's also something you have to realize. I think there's, for good reasons, UAE and I think also Saudi is driving a lot of nationalization of jobs, like Emiratization, Saudi nationals, etc. Of course, at the same time, it will also mean for the expats that want to stay here long term, that we have to take that element into account also when we do our job planning or when companies do their job planning. It's a very difficult one because I fully understand why governments want to employ their basically their own nationals in certain jobs. But yeah, we need to find a good balance there. And I think an open dialogue with the government between private sector, public sector, etc., would be good around this point. It's not only around Emiratization. It's not only about Saudi nationals. It's also kind of like, how do we live together in a happy way? And I think so far we do. The fact that I've been here for over 10 years means the country does a lot of good and the region does a lot of good.
Very true.
I think
Craig, your thoughts?
Just adding on to that very briefly, I think one of the things that I think Gio mentioned was about, in my interpretation of that, your own personal mindset when you come to the region, because you have to understand that it's very much part of the national agenda. So traditionally, I followed a career in London, and you would learn through experience, gain qualifications, and move through the ranks to senior positions. All of that's still absolutely available within the region, but I think as long as you understand the rules of the game, I guess, which is ultimately, this is about supporting the Emiratis to develop, learn and grow. And that in the future at some point may mean that means you have to change yourself. So as long as you are okay with that, and I have to be honest, that's maybe one of the challenges that I had to get my head around when I came to the region, which was, this could be as long or as short as this journey is, but I still would not have changed anything that I've done because of the richness of the learning. And I think the other piece that does, that mindset opens you up to different opportunities across different industries, and some wonderful opportunities come of it if your mindset is correct. If you come in with a one-dimensional mindset, expecting it to be a similar career to how you were in another part of the world, then that bubble will probably be popped. You have to learn how to adapt and change in terms of your thinking. So I think, the guys have already said it, Brad, to be fair, but that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, I think to a certain degree, it's a dynamic that happens all over the world. But coming back again to Gio's initial comment, I think back to my second HR job many years ago. And I'm a Canadian working in Canada, and I was working for a non-Canadian organization, and they brought in someone to be my boss who was younger than me, and trust me, great person and everything, but how it affects your own personal career planning when you are grooming your boss, where they're taking your expertise and it's open, it's transparent. But make no mistake, one of the reasons I left that organization was because of that message that was sent to me as a worker, that there are certain groups within the workforce who are of a certain categorization and others of a different categorization, and each organization, every country, every culture has to find the right balance for that. And as HR professionals, people professionals, it's certainly, whether you're in Dubai, whether you're in UAE, whether you're in Canada, whether you're in Europe, these are things that are dynamics in different ratios, but we should all be thinking about. But one of the topics that came up in the last question was technology. And I'm going to turn this back to David, is, and I'm sure all of us have sort of a thought and comment and insight on it, but what do you see, David, in terms of technology's role as it relates to the work experience in the Middle East and the GCC, and how that weaves into all of the things we've been discussing so far, from expats to innovation and knowledge economy. What are your thoughts on that?
Right. I see a lot of technology, and when you talk about technology, things like automation, AI, I see a lot coming up. I wouldn't say that at this stage, besides maybe the government, but outside of the government, I don't think we're ahead of the game when you look to Europe or the US. But I have to admit that I only visit at the moment Europe and US in that way. So it's kind of like you see it on one side. Some organizations are very much ahead of the game. There is a high level of automation already achieved. People are talking about AI. Some of them, they are just in the first step of the journey in that way, are still very classical. When I look back, I think in general, the private sector, smaller type companies are still more operating like I experienced probably before 2000 back in Europe. I sometimes felt like I was a bit back in time. So yes, they're catching up. Is that going to be fast enough? I don't know. I feel like there could be even an increased effort to catch up in terms of technology at the workplace.
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the comments I've said to many people, and I'll share it with the panel and obviously anyone watching this, is that when you are doing a recruiting function in this region, oftentimes you will actually look to parts of the world for their experience. It may be Europe, it may be North America, it may be Asia, because of the industry experience, the clustering of expertise. And I think when people around the world start to say, hey, I want someone with Middle East experience or GCC experience or experience from Abu Dhabi or some other country in our emirate in our region, that will be a sign that the economy itself has reached a different level. And I think that's, in my mind, the next level everyone's trying to get to, is where you quit saying, oh, let's target someone from Singapore or London or New York because of that region's expertise. When you have someone in New York saying, I want someone from Dubai because of that unique chemistry and work experience, then I think, and it's a very personal opinion, but again, I'll open it up. Craig, Gio, your thoughts on this?
I think you're absolutely right. I think if you look at all of the things that you've just said, that whole opportunity to develop something here and support the country to do something that traditionally may not be seen in the wider world as a hub of this, and to actually see that evolve into people looking at Dubai for that experience, I think absolutely is very real, very true. I agree with your opinion. I think from, you know, that comes back to that misconception question you asked at the start. There's a lot of people that have a misconception that you have to come from external into here, and I think that's absolutely been true, but that may not be true going forward, because and I think when you think about where Dubai is as a place in the GCC, innovation, use of technology is absolutely at the heart of all of this stuff. You know, we're talking about introduction of LXP platforms, all the things that traditionally people would be familiar with, but a real drive and support to do this. And one of the things that I've been blessed with is the ability to act with speed. So traditionally, when I worked for a large organization back in the West, it took ages to go through the layers of bureaucracy. Here, I can get things done very quickly. And I guess I'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of a different approach to the work. But yeah, absolutely concur. And I think there will be a point in time where that will shift. And I think with that mixture of, you know, being able to work across all the different cultures, because let's be frank, there's 200 plus cultures here, and that ability to transact and effectively deliver in all of that environment, I think it's a massive valuable skill set. It's my opinion as well.
Well, I've heard many expats say that, Craig, is they come here and when they're new, I mean, we all sort of adapt to the environments we're in, but often when you're new and you see the hunger for early adoption on many different levels, and some people maybe sometimes are critical, especially of sort of the audacity of a place like Dubai. But when you live here and you see that it's part of a broader agenda to say, let's be world class, and we're not really sure exactly which one of the, you know, the pillars of world class we're going to, and things evolve. Let's just aspire to be world class in as much as possible. And sometimes some of that comes off as being a bit audacious, and other times, as I was saying, you know, expats will come here and say, wow, I just had a meeting, and they're actually really hungry and sincere about early adoption and change. Gio, your thoughts?
Well, when I first got here, I was fortunate enough, privileged actually, to kind of help set up this organization that you and I know quite well. And, you know, the amount of crazy ideas that I could bring to the table, and I would just get a go ahead, pilot it, try out. It's insane. Like, you know, back to both David and Craig's point, back home, wherever home would be, that would have never ever happened. But here it's kind of like, you know what? You know, if you don't shoot, you're always miss, right? So aim for the stars. And it's been really, really great. I think, you know, one thing I'll say is I think there's a great opportunity here. I think the region, to David's point, compared to more what you would call more mature markets, maybe still has a lot of traditional HR problems that it needs to solve, or, you know, kind of like work-related problems that we need to solve. But my hope is this: combining the kind of vision that the royal family and the government really have for the region with the abundance of new technologies that's available today. I'm kind of hoping that instead of going to that same linear path, you kind of leapfrog a bunch of that stuff and immediately go to the future of work. There's really no need for this region to fix some of these incremental changes that, you know, more mature markets have gone through over the last 20 years, when you can just use technology and literally leapfrog to the end of the finish line and kind of start a brand new idea of what work should look like. And I think the region has every potential to do it. And I guess the next 5 years, well, if for those of you familiar with the region, maybe the next 5 months will tell us whether or not that's going to be realistic.
Well, I was out for dinner with someone last night, and one of the topics came up was the airline industry globally. And I think most people who are familiar with airlines in the Gulf, the GCC region, and the quality and the, but to your point, Gio, was this idea that I think one of the strengths that Gulf carriers have been able to take advantage of is that they sort of leapfrogged over certain things that weren't legacy issues, and some of them are workforce issues and other things. But it's definitely an opportunity. And again, I think people who come to the region who are astute in capturing these things early see it as a benefit for their own personal development as well. I think a lot of these issues converge on one of the hot topics of workplaces around the world, and is this idea of an agile workforce, an agile HR. And it almost seems like almost a lot of the things we've been talking about so far converge upon this concept. And I wanted to ask all three of you, but maybe I'll start with Craig. What are your thoughts in terms of this concept of agility at work, agile HR, and how it relates to our region, the Middle East, GCC?
It's a really interesting subject, because I've been looking at this probably closely for about the last 12 months, and it's an integral part of my team restructure. So there's lots of different papers that I've been reading. Obviously, I think everyone's familiar with the concept of what agile is, and it's not about, you know, taking it to the extreme lengths of the IT side of things. It's about how you take some of those theories and principles and how that could work within not only just the region, but also within the HR and what I look after, the talent and learning setup. And it's been something that's grown quite a lot of momentum. So I read a really good paper in May last year from Josh Bershin in relation to this, in terms of it really interesting, because it aligned to my thinking. Because at one point I was thinking, am I pushing too hard in this space? Because for me, it's about how I can make my team more efficient with the resources that we've got, and be able to think differently and in an agile way to get things done differently. That then necessitated meetings with my network in the region. I started to go out to understand who else was doing this, and to be frank, it's in pockets. So there are companies that are starting to use the concepts of agile. I've also, I'm very much aware that the principles of agile are talked about, but then when you look underneath the skin of it, sometimes the substance is not always joining up. So one of the things that we're really keen to do is and I'll give you my own experience, is to work on this with the team, because let's be frank, in agile, one of the fundamental components of that is engagement. If the team don't understand, if the team are not engaged in exactly the change of direction, then it's never going to work. So we've spent quite a bit of time doing the engagement phase, and we're starting to now see traction. So for example, we're having stand-up meetings, Scrum, and all of that type of stuff you would associate with agile, but hook it up with the innovation. So and I think this comes back to the opportunities that the region gives you. it's given me an opportunity to be far more creative and innovative than I ever used to be back working in London. So on that, I've taken full advantage of that. So it's about how you can then harness some of those principles and methodologies. Within our business, we have our own innovation labs, and there's lots of great, exciting things that are happening within that space. So very much it's about how we hook up our business acumen, how we join up with the guys. So we're all on that same journey. And within the talent and learning space specifically, there's not as much activity as I thought there would be. And again, the guys may have a view on this, but when I've researched it, there's lots of superficial stuff again, but it's about how we really take agile. And what I've said to my team is, yeah, for this year, guys, what we're going to do agile with a small a. So this is not a full out, blown out agile approach to everything. It's about taking some of those simple principles and applying it into our day-to-day work principles and disciplines. And we're now starting to see some traction. You know, the guys are using terminologies. It's really great to watch. And I'm starting to see a real sense that with encouragement and I guess great support from leadership, we will see a transition. But I think across the region, there are pockets of great activity, and maybe some pockets of people that are thinking about it and haven't fully transitioned. So guys, I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well,
yeah, I think just let me transition for a sec, David. You know, Gio mentioned earlier about sort of the transient workforce, and I think to some extent, for better or worse, small a agile, if you're not agile in this region, you're not going to be effective. And whether that's being strategic or reactionary is a different question. But I think all of the panelists' comments earlier is it part of the value of our personal learning experience isn't just the diversity of culture that we work with, but this need to be agile, which is a need that's all over the world. So go ahead, David.
Yeah, I want to highlight a little bit of another aspect which you can call agile. So on one side, we have a lot of traditional companies with traditional methodology. At the same time, when you look in the UAE, there's such a startup entrepreneurial culture. There's so many tech startups, people trying to work together, co-working, creativity, etc. So you can see it's almost like it's typically, at least for the UAE, but I think also for a larger part of the Middle East, this is kind of like almost like controversy between, on one side, traditional companies that still need to go to this change versus a huge startup community, people that try to work in different ways together. And I really like that latter aspect as well. And I think once they get together, and I know some large multinationals out of the UAE, they have these incubators, they adopt technology, they take on companies, they take on people that have different experiences. I think that will create a great synergy. I mean, it's not exactly agile, but it's, let's say, another aspect on how we can create a more agile work experience.
Gio?
I find agile HR very difficult, frankly speaking. And, you know, I speak at conferences and people usually ask me about these things. I'm like, you know, I find it difficult because I understand what agile is, but I'm not sure if we all understand agile the same way. And I'll touch a little bit on something that Craig said, right? There's a lot of kind of, I hope I'm paraphrasing correctly. There's a lot of superficiality going around when some people talk about what they do with agile. And I think if you're going to do it, you got to do it right. And you got to do it for the right reasons, right? And that means you got to move it beyond the buzzword. Now, I happen to know Craig, and I happen to know he told me a little bit before we started about what he's doing, and that is agile. That's a mindset shift. That's a completely fundamentally different way of doing something with a strategic purpose behind it. But I think what I also see, and I advise companies, and they ask me about it, and usually I ask why you want to do it, and it feels like often it's more it's just the cool thing to do, right? We read an article in HBR, and it's like we need to do agile. And that leads me to the second point that I have with agile, or anything new in HR in terms of ways of working. I fundamentally support all of them. I think agile is great, right? I think embedding design thinking is great. Let me make that perfectly clear. Here's the problem for most organizations, though. If you're still struggling to do the basics right, if your business is still not happy with the basic level of service delivery as an HR function, if you're still perceived or maybe even actually operating as a personnel administration, right, then you really have no business looking into things like agile. I think that's the difference. Again, right, there's organizations that have fixed some of those basics, and now we're starting to look for where do I, back to my earlier comment, how do you leapfrog? And agile is a great way to do that. But I also see quite a few organizations that they're like, one foot is still in the how do we solve the day to day, and then the other foot is how do we usher in the future. And I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's very, very difficult to do that.
I couldn't agree with you more. I actually had a talk in the Philippines maybe a year and a half ago, and it was very much along the same line. I think that's when, at least in my experience, the agile concept was really a hot topic in our community. And I agree with you, Gio, is that, you know, some people are just following a trend and others are really true to the, if you will, the science of being agile. And I think that we can say that for a lot of things in HR. You know, there's buzzwords, there's concepts, there's change, you know, there's employee experience, and you know, HR business partner. Well, all of a sudden I was a manager, now I'm an HR business partner, but nothing else has changed. So these are universal issues, and I don't think there's anything unique or special about the Middle East relative to the world. But I do think, as people who would call themselves people professionals, HR professionals, talent professionals, you ought to be the one, like hopefully we are, is saying, you know, there's sort of, here's the concept, here's the science behind it, here's what some organizations do, and hopefully you're doing what's right for your organization. So I think we're getting closer to the end here, and I wanted to ask, if I was watching our video, our stream right now, probably one of the questions I would have as an HR professional is, you guys say that you're in a diverse part of the world with a diverse workforce. Where's the gender diversity? You know, and I'm going to answer my own question to anyone who's watching right now, is that we did actually intend to have two other individuals, two ladies, attend, but for reasons of their work, they weren't able to attend. So that's, you know, as the moderator, full disclosure, we're not ignorant of our own shortcomings in terms of the diversity of our region. I don't know, anyone want to sort of comment on the broader question of diversity in the GCC in the Middle East?
I'll say a couple of things real quick, if you guys let me. I think there's two things to say. One is that there's a common misperception, and probably a lot of our audience being based in the US may have this idea about the role of women in the region. And I think one of the things, if you come back to the misconceptions that you learn very quickly when you come here, is that, you know, in particular in the native cultures here, the role of women is actually pretty strong and powerful.
Yes,
right?
I couldn't agree more.
The second thing is, I think, again, and it's mainly a government thing, but if I look at how the government has been pushing women, and, you know, young women, I would say youth in general, women specifically, youth women even more so, in positions of, you know, in ministry posts or running large projects. You know, the Expo 2020 is a massive project. It's been quite impressive, and you can see there's an invisible hand actively guiding this kind of development. And I think, you know, I work with a bank, Craig works with a bank, and one of the things that they're pushing really hard is that they want to increase the number of women sitting on boards, right? They're actively pushing for more women participation in boards and in corporate governance in general. And I think that's a great thing to do. But it's not something I've seen in many other geographies developing. So that's the one thing I'll say about the women topic.
Well, I've said to people in this region too, and outside the region, that coming back to this idea of so many foreigners in your indigenous culture, if you want to maintain your indigenous culture, you have to engage your culture, and that's men and women. So whether it's UAE, whether it's Saudi, whether it's the other parts of this region, I think there's a misconception about the role of women in this part of the world, the influence of women in the part of the world. And there's sort of certain superficial things like changes in driving in Saudi, where some people might say, well, that's, I don't know about you, but the Saudi ladies that I know, they said, you know, driving before the change was sort of the least of my concerns, you know. And I think a lot of us, men or women, would like the idea to think, well, I have a driver, you know, that's very convenient to have a driver. So again, those people watching outside of the region, part of the purpose of our particular panel today is to deal with some of the misconceptions that might be there, and certainly room for improvement, no question. Craig, David, thoughts? Diversity?
Well, yeah, I was thinking like about his comment about the 4 white male faces on this panel.
Yeah.
So when I got to the UAE, before I got to the UAE, I was part of a majority I'm actually part of a minority in this country. It's a kind of like, it gives a very different perception on diversity. It's a very complicated topic here, I would say. On one side, we're very diverse. I think we need to speak more about inclusion. And I think there are some great drives in that way as well. I recently attended a speech on SureMTech, and there was an Emirati person working for Expo 2020. His speech about inclusion was just mind-blowing and so true. And I feel like this is where we need to work harder on it, because there are certain medical tests before you can start working here. There are certain things that certain things you need to comply with. I think the whole inclusion drive is something, not only women, but let's say overall diversity inclusion is an important topic that we should continue to push for this region. Greg, what's your view?
Guys, I think you've pretty much covered it. I think, yeah, on a unique scenario, I'm facing the other challenge when I have positions come up available in my team, because I'm a massive supporter of Emiratisation, looking to diversify my team as the team evolves and grows over time. I'd like more male Emiratis to come into my team. So my team at the moment is female heavy in that respect. So there's 2 other guys apart from myself in the team. The rest of the team are made from ladies, and we have a very good diverse set of nationalities, which I want to make even more diverse. So I won't repeat all of the things the guys will say, because I agree completely, but it's also about how we make what we do more attractive to male Emiratis as well as female Emiratis. So just a different spin on that.
Yeah, and I love the distinction that's being made, and I emphasize it as well, is, you know, diversity and inclusion aren't one thing. And I think the movement of diversity and inclusion started with diversity, and it was more easily measured and demonstrated on more superficial characteristics. But when you start focusing on inclusion, it's a much deeper concept. And I do think that is one area where, for better or worse, this region is not strong at, because we mentioned it earlier in this discussion about expats staying within their expat communities and nationals staying with their national communities. And if you really want to leverage the strength of the diversity, you have to be more inclusive. And part of the inclusion is having different people with different backgrounds actually be true to who they are, to be true to their culture, and actually leverage that strength. And I think it's a global issue, but it is one of the areas where I look at other markets with similar diversity, places like Singapore, and I do think they approached it historically from a very different point of view. You know, I don't know where you gentlemen live in Dubai, but you know, you have pockets where there's certain nationalities, you have Emiratis, you have expats, and I know the history of Singapore was that Lee Kuan Yew was very deliberate in saying we have to avoid this sort of pockets of culture within our diverse community. And that was, from a government point of view, one of the ways he approached it. And then there's no simple solutions to these complex human issues, but thank you all for that comment. And I think as we approach the end, one of the uniquenesses I know when I first came here 14 years ago was that you were either a full-time employee or you were unemployed. Like there was nothing in the middle. You were, as an expat, you were on sponsorship and you were a full-time employee. And there was such a huge amount of the workforce that was not engaged because they didn't fit that profile. And you know, the gig economy, again, another one of the hot topics around the world. But I do think in the Middle East and the GCC, we have sort of a uniqueness. It's not just the expat to national ratio, it's the maturity of the workforce and the labor market and the laws. So again, no, I'm not focusing the question very well, but I want to leave it to you three to sort of choose your focus of the question. What is the state of affairs of the gig economy right now, in your opinion, in the Middle East and the GCC? Anyone?
I think it's starting, but I think one of the challenges here is what we call sponsorship. Almost every, at least for the expat community, everyone needs to have a sponsorship, and you can only have one. What also makes it hard to do 2 or 3 jobs at the same time, like I'm doing as well. Like there is nothing wrong with having different roles, different activities, combine them and make a living out of that, or do it for fun or passion or whatsoever. I think this. I think the legal framework still needs to adapt this idea of having different activities at the same time, doing a short-term gig, etc. I mean, think about it. If you need to hire someone and you need to provide a visa, it's a big expense for a company. So if you only bring that person in for 2 or 3 months, it doesn't work. It doesn't work from a financial perspective. So I think there are a few things that the government can do, at least for the UAE. Probably in other countries, it's probably similar in that way, to make this flexibility of work better and support the gig economy.
I think we're starting to see that. Yeah, I think you're starting to see that level of flexibility now. And as I said earlier on, having had the privilege and honour of working very closely with the ministries on emiratization initiatives a couple of years back, gave me a really great insight into how innovation was driving it, and also how barriers or potential barriers like you've just described, Dave, are being tackled. So these things obviously take time, but I think we're all starting to see across the GCC a change in terms of approach to how things are operating, and maybe how that word flexibility is kind of joining up on many of those aspects. So I think my opinion, and guys please challenge me, I think as we start to go forward in time, you'll see more of that flexibility being built in to how people will operate, because the world is changing, and it comes back to the point around agile approach, right? But you can't have a traditional way in a world now that's evolving at such a pace. So you have to respect the tradition, but you also have to have a mindset that says, okay, let's open this up to, what can we do, respecting all the respective laws, cultures and stuff, but still keep us in a headspace that keeps us competitive. And I think that's the beauty of the region, because it moves fast, and I think we've all seen this across the GCC. All those changes are happening right now.
You?
Yeah, I agree with both of them. I agree with all three of you, actually. I think it links back to that topic we talked about earlier about the visas, right? And how do you kind of restructure the legal framework behind that? And to David and Craig's points, I think the government is actively aware of the fact that there might be a problem now, but it definitely is going to be one in the future. So how do you rethink this whole system of how you allow people to work, both from a longer term perspective, retirement perspective, talent retention perspective, but also to accommodate for fundamentally new ways of work, whether it's, gig work or even remote work, which hasn't really penetrated the region that much. It's interesting though, because if you look at this region, the whole region, I would say, it's one of the places where almost everyone next to their job has a side hustle, and that is socially completely and legally completely acceptable, right? And in most geographies I worked, you could never do that, but here everyone has like a little cafe or a bar or a consultancy or something on the side, and that's perfectly normal. So what I'm trying to say is, intrinsically in the region, this idea of being an entrepreneur and being a businessman is very embedded. It's just about, like to David's point, it's about expanding the legal framework around it to kind of enable it to the fullest.
Yeah, I mean, we're in a region, and it's probably a topic for another day, which is historically dominated by the family business culture. And I've often said in different environments, I don't care if you're working for government, the private sector, almost all of us work in a family business because of the way the governance structures are here. You could be working for a bank, but the board of directors are locals, and it trickles down. So coming back to this idea of entrepreneurship, gig economy, my experience globally is these things are present almost everywhere in the world, but their nuances are slightly different. And I do know that in terms of having a second or third job, that especially in Dubai, for example, there is the opportunity now to have your own business license separate from your primary sponsorship. And that didn't exist 2, 3, 4 years ago. So we genuinely see these improvements in terms of the infrastructure and the legalities of these types of things. So we're coming to a close, and I want to wrap things up and just thank all of our panel for your insights and a lot of wisdom. And I hope the people watching this have also gained some insight that they may not have expected from our region. I want to thank Enrique for including our region and promoting us. Sometimes you see these online communities that don't necessarily focus on our region. I think what you're doing, Enrique, is wonderful for the community, the engagement that you're putting into this, and the organic nature of bringing together professionals who want to collaborate and advance the profession globally is very unique. So on behalf of the panel, I want to thank Enrique for all the work you're doing, and thank you to the panelists for your participation today. And anyone watching, I want to wish you best rest of your day and best rest of your week. Bye from Dubai, everyone.
Thank you.